Demonized and suppressed by the war on drugs, psychedelic medicines are making their return, and we're here to bring you the latest in scientific research and therapeutic practices involving psychedelic medicines from psilocybin to ayahuasca to DMT and beyond. This is the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. I'm your guide on this journey, Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, and today we are talking about the effects of setting on psychedelic journeys with Dr. Frederick Barrett. Dr. Fred Barrett is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the associate center director for the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. Dr. Barrett has been conducting psychedelic research at Johns Hopkins University since 2013, and he is leading a number of ongoing studies aimed at better understanding the psychological, biological, and neural mechanisms underlying therapeutic efficacy of psychedelic drugs. Now, I hope you enjoy our discussion today because we are getting into more of the nitty-gritty about what we mean when we say that set and setting are important. Especially today, we are focused on setting. So if you have wondered, what exactly do they mean? What are the elements of setting? What may be more beneficial? That's what we're going to get into today. Now, before we get started, just a reminder that the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical or legal advice. And one last reminder, if you are a clinician and you would like to learn more about psychedelic medicines and how they may impact your patient practice in the future, we invite you to join us in the Psychedelic Medicine Association, where it is our mission to educate you on those very important upcoming developments in psychedelic medicine. So if you are interested and you'd like to learn more, head on over to psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Now, without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Fred.
Thank you, Lynn, for having me and for having this very interesting podcast.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And I'm really glad to have this conversation because we talk all the time about set and setting, but we rarely get granular into not only what we mean by that. I think we know what we mean, but what is the proper set and what is the proper setting? And so when I saw that you and your co-authors had put out a paper regarding having evaluated what has been investigated as far as setting goes, I was really excited to have that conversation with you. So the paper we're referring, and we'll link to it in the show notes, is called Effects of Setting on Psychedelic Experiences, Therapies, and Outcomes. And at the beginning of that paper, you pose 4 questions. And so I think that gives us a great outline of how to look at this. So the first question you posed was, what aspects of setting have been studied and with which psychedelic substances?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area and overall a fascinating question. What uh, effects do set and setting have on psychedelic experiences? The one of the main takeaways from this paper, which wasn't entirely surprising to us, is that lots of people talk about set and setting, and I think it's just implicitly understood or expected that yeah, of course, set and setting matter, and a lot of at the end of the day, a lot of this is really driven by personal anecdote, clinical opinion, history, and the importance of controlling and defining set and setting through various traditions. And let me be clear, these are all very important, and they're a very important piece of information. They're very important to the evolution of therapies and of practices like these. But these are all testable hypotheses. Every element of set or setting that someone believes is important is an element that can be tested. We have good methods in the scientific method for trying to answer these questions of whether something is actually having an effect or not. And the evidence, the literature in psychology and experimental psychology especially is replete with examples of things we think to be true, which under scrutiny are not true. A really hot button issue that is even more important to understand, in our current society, is the issue of implicit bias, right? Um, Implicit bias is something that is really tricky and really kind of ornery in a way, in so many levels. We all have implicit biases, and we shouldn't shy away from that fact. And we should do whatever we can to understand our own implicit biases and how they affect our behavior. But if you go up and ask someone, well, do you have racial biases? Do you have gender biases? Oh, not of course not me. No, not of course me. But you know what? Our behaviors don't necessarily reflect that. And I think there's a I'm not saying that we should be thinking about set and setting in terms of implicit bias necessarily, though maybe that's an interesting question to ask. Um, I think we should just be open to the fact that what we assume to be true is not always quite true the way we think it is. And so that was one of the motivations for doing this. And we essentially scoured the literature, every piece of paper, every report that we could find from the beginning of the early stages of psychedelic research to the present. Um, and I think that the question you posed right there was the first question that we posed in the paper. What elements of setting have been studied empirically? And essentially, out of an initial, greater than 1,000 item list of papers that we found through our initial search, we 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 identified 42 that is it 42? Are you going to edit this?
It's 43. I looked it up.
43. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah. So 43, but of those 43, there are only a subset that 22 studies that actually reported outcome measures that were tested, right? Out of all of this literature, the one thing that became clear to us was that everybody talks about set and setting, and many papers affirm that set and setting are important, but very few actually empirically test an element of set and setting. So one of the elements of and in this paper, of course, we only focus on setting. I think if possible, we can get around to the question of whether setting and set are truly separable in the way we expect them to be as well. This is something we struggle with. We'll get there. So some of the general kind of categories of setting and elements of setting that we identified are general elements of setting, such as having a supportive environment overall, or whether you were in kind of a party environment versus like a controlled or more kind of thoughtfully constructed spiritual or therapeutic environment. But these early studies, I'm thinking of Eisner and Cohen, and I'm thinking of Felice and Zara and even Olson. There's a recent uncontrolled study that suggested that psychedelic environments and expectancy itself alone with no drug can actually generate psychedelic like experiences. That was a fascinating study. It can be considered both in terms of the power of set and setting, also the power of suggestibility and expectation, right, and expectancy. And so these questions about setting and expectancy and set are all wrapped up into each other. Essentially, what we're doing by controlling set and setting are, in a way, we can think of that as like supercharging expectancy, right? You're putting and outside of psychedelic experiences, just considering um, ritual in our everyday lives, ritual in the most innocuous sense. Like every morning I get up, I pour a cup of coffee, I make sure I have my keys in my wallet, and then I walk out the door. That sets my mind into a certain framework where I know what to expect next, whether that be frustrating or not, sitting in traffic. But in so many religious contexts, obviously ritual plays an important role. I was born Episcopalian, raised Catholic, and then took a foray into quite a few different kind of non-traditional religious paths. But in each of these settings, there are setting and set at play. Going into the Catholic Mass, you should be quiet. You should kneel and stand up in a certain order. There are prayers, there are songs. We shake hands and say peace be with you. All of these things, all of these elements of ritual contribute to our worship, right? And they're all important. And training in martial arts, putting on a gi, and then bowing into class, and then sets a mental space. There were a few initial studies that basically went as far as saying, look, when you compare a carefully constructed space to a non-carefully constructed space. It looks like, more important things happen in that carefully constructed space. But these early studies didn't go to the degree of addressing which, if any, elements of that space had a particular effect. And this is a theme that kind of carries through the published literature to date, with just very few exceptions. So you have just the general setting. Is this a thoughtfully constructed space? Are you going in with intention? Yeah, that might have an effect on the experience. A couple of other studies compared psychedelic experiences in different social and cultural settings. So, yeah, more recently, was it Leo or Roseman published a study looking at the effect of different sociocultural differences between Israelis and Palestinians, taking ayahuasca, right? And came away with the report that ayahuasca supported feelings of understanding and unity between these two very these cultures with very challenging historical relationship, to put it lightly, right? And that's important. That's incredibly important. But what about that experience really led to those feelings of unity and understanding? It's important to know that ayahuasca can bring these two peoples together. But what was it about the set and setting? What was it about the interaction, the environment? Was there anything in particular that was more or less supportive and helpful? That is, and absolutely no knock on Leor. This is an incredible study that he wrote about. It just goes to stepping back for a second. So many of these questions that we can ask about setting. I liken both set and setting, and the elements of set and setting, to not only levers that can be pressed, but like a veritable church organ, full of levers that can be pressed to various degrees and in combination, and essentially, when trying to answer questions about what elements of set and setting are important or supportive, are really acting in a particular role in psychedelic experiences, it's almost dazzling and disorienting to think about where to start. Well, where do I start? And in the completely reductionist sense, so many behavioral psychology studies that have been published over the decades try as hard as they can to control every single aspect of an experience or an interaction or an intervention, so that they can really distill down to manipulations on just one certain variable or category of experience or intervention, so they can really tightly understand the relationship of that one variable to all the other things that are going on. And frankly, wow, how impossible does that seem, right? So I want to be clear that I'm not trying to kind of undermine the value of doing the studies that have been conducted so far. I just want to acknowledge the difficulty in doing these things. So there was that study. There have been studies looking at uh, support and social support and safety measures in concert goers or festival goers who are seeking medical attention. And what elements of kind of social support were more or less helpful for those participants. That's a very which slicked in 1972. It's a very particular group of people they're selected out for that study, who were having these challenging experiences during these festivals and sought treatment. Right. There are lots of other things wrapped up in that. If we were to try to bring that forward to our current days and situations, there are lots of really wonderful folks doing an awful lot of work in harm reduction to try to help people to understand what compounds they are taking in these settings. And sometimes the compound you think you're taking is not the compound that you're taking, right? And so the importance of testing in these environments is incredibly, it can't be stressed enough. If we're going to limit our understanding of especially things like set and setting to those individuals who are seeking treatment for challenging experiences, you could take that to the case of folks who show up at an ER, right, or folks who show up to the medical tent at a festival, or what's the blanking on the tent that MAPS manages
Zendo?
at Zendo. You show up at Zendo. How did you get there, and then what are you really experiencing? I think gives you only a very limited view of what elements of set and setting can be important in psychedelic experiences. There was One of the elements of set and setting in general that we found to be addressed across a number of different studies was the question of specific ritual or ceremonial settings. And there's one particular study um, by Barbosa in 2005, which I found fascinating. So Barbosa had conducted an observational study that investigated the experiences of two separate ceremonial groups. He found a Santo Daime church and a União de Vegetal church, and essentially compared and contrasted, uh, uh, by passive observation, and then also by trying to measure the degree of different variables that people reported, during and after the experience. He tried to come up with some understanding of the differences in the set and setting of these two churches. So the way he characterized, or the way Barbosa characterized this, was that in one way, the Santo Daime and UDV experiences were very different. And in the Santo Daime church that Barbosa observed that, ceremonies lasted from 4 to 12 hours. They were characterized by like active engagement of congregants. Everybody's getting up, singing, dancing, and fully participating in the ritual, which um, contrasted quite starkly to the UDV experience, which was, in this particular instance, the ceremonies lasted at most 4 hours. Were characterized by passive observation of singing and dancing by study participants. And I would, liken this to, sitting calmly in your pew in church and letting the priest up front do all the work, versus like, actively engaging in the ritual. So participants, this was the report, they differed in the degree of awe and peace or psychological insight they experienced during the two ceremonies. And maybe that shouldn't be too surprising. Um, uh, and it could bring into sharp relief the importance of active engagement in these experiences versus passive engagement. But um, when you want to kind of zero in on exactly what was important here, was it just the overall picture? Was it everything? Or was the dancing, if participants were dancing and not singing, if they were singing and not dancing, if the UDV experience was just simply longer, right? If there was more kind of pomp and circumstance built up around it, would that yield similarity in the outcome? So this really characterizes most of the work that's been done in this area so far. Yeah, and I'll come back to the challenging nature of conducting these studies. It's very expensive to conduct, especially controlled laboratory studies with psychedelic compounds, and it takes a lot to get these studies through all of the regulatory hoops and ladders that are necessary, at least in the U.S., to conduct these studies. And so when an opportunity to conduct a study comes along, do you spend 5 years and the experiences of 40 or 50 people, or 12 people even, to answer one really minute question about the volume of the music that you played? Some people get like really soft music, and other people get really loud music. I'm kind of going out on a limb here and really offering a bit of an absurd question that could be asked. But lots of questions, if you want to ask them really in a really precise fashion, you have to get down to the nitty gritty of exactly what variables are you controlling. And to this point, I think in the field, we've been chasing the very important question of whether we can help people to heal at all with these compounds. And right, of course, the signals so far have been very promising. Um, uh, but these studies so far have been done with a certain formula, or various riffs on a formula that we're seeing effects with, right? Lie on a couch, eye shades and headphones. Maybe we have the Bill Richards playlist, or we have Mendel Kalin's playlist, or someone else comes up with their own music playlist. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? I mean, if these things that we're doing so far are really working to help people to heal, and if we're finding really replicable positive effects, then do we need to go into detail in spending the time and money that is necessary to understanding exactly which of these knobs is having the most effect on the experience? Well, maybe that's not the most important question to start, but thankfully now we're getting to the point where people are beginning to say, yeah, we're finding these effects, and now there are lots of people who are, getting coming online to do more studies like this. So maybe it is time to kind of step back and begin to play with these knobs and to see if we can begin to optimize the experience, because yeah, certainly not everybody has a therapeutic effect with psilocybin. So in the JAMA Psychiatry paper with patients with major depressive disorder that Hopkins published now, yeah, almost a year and a half ago, we demonstrated just a startling treatment effect that we just now published a follow-up study that we showed, even a year later, over 50% of individuals in that study are in remission from depression, and over 70% of individuals in the study showed a clinically significant response, which is greater than 50% reduction in their depressive symptomatology or depression severity from baseline. And to have that type of durability of response a year later is just remarkable. But obviously not everybody saw that treatment response. 10 to 20% of individuals in the study who did not become well after this treatment. Is there anything that we can do to help those people as well, or to optimize this treatment? And so that's why we're coming back to this question now. And so this scoping review, I think, is going to be really important, just to set the foundation of what we know and what we don't know and what should be done next. I still haven't answered your question, so sorry, I've gotten off on a tangent.
No worries. All valuable.
No, thanks. So we have just this, the general aspect of whether set and setting are controlled at all, really setting in particular, whether there are, cultural or social aspects of setting that are at play, whether there are ritual or ceremonial aspects of setting that are at play. Of course, near and dear to my heart is the question of music. Music seems to, by all accounts, be one of the most powerful aspects of setting that folks report on when they go through, at least in the trials that I've been a part of, the trials that I've run, but also, anecdotes from folks who've been participants in trials at other institutes, in recent memory. Music seems to play an overwhelming role in shaping and some people think driving their psychedelic experience. Uh, the acknowledgments here need to include that, if you're following the model that Hopkins uses, people are wearing eye shades and they're told to lay on a couch, in a bit of a cocoon with a comfy blanket. So you're really kind of cutting off, the visual experience, the outward visual experience, right? And you're cutting out the possibility for dance or movement, and we don't engage aromatherapy really in a systematic fashion at all. And so there are lots of other elements of set and setting, especially things that factor into ritual and ceremonial contexts, that aren't variables that are pushed around in our psychedelic sessions. So maybe it's no surprise that music plays such a big role, because we're really limiting people's experience out, in external interaction to music. But that said, music, people will say things such as, I was the music, or there was nothing but the music, or I had such a deep listening experience that I felt like I understood the intentions of the composer when they were writing this, or I could feel the performers, or all of these things, or my visual experience was inseparable from my auditory experience, right? Even with eye shades and headphones, and it's I think it's clear to me that, if nothing, music can be a powerful aspect of setting. Um, one of the first studies actually did randomize people to uh, randomly selected music that is unfamiliar and disliked, or no music at all. And that was and they found that music that later was related to themes of religion or romantic love were found to be the most beneficial during psychedelic therapy sessions. These were reported by Gaston and Eagle in 1970, and also by Eagle again in 1972. But it's difficult from those papers to really understand how well controlled the studies were, if other aspects of the therapeutic experience were explicitly or implicitly or unintentionally kind of manipulated or if a person, if a study team member or a therapist knows that, oh, we're gonna give you the no music condition, this is gonna suck, right? And like, man, I'm just here to help. Like, I'll do whatever I can to, like, make sure you get through it. But we'll get through this together. But listen, there's gonna be no music. Hey, guess what? You just completely manipulated their internal set to expect this to suck, and that could have a much stronger experience impact on the experience than no music at all. So we this is still unpublished, but we conducted a study. The first psychedelic study I was ever involved with is a study of individuals who had a long-term meditation practice, and we enrolled and completed 40 individuals who to whom we administered a high dose of psilocybin. One of the questions we wanted to ask in this study was, whether there's any detectable kind of support for something that seems to be, widely accepted, which is the idea that psychedelics may be able to bring you to places that you can encounter through a dedicated meditation practice, or that can bring you to places that can be encountered, during a long-term meditation retreat. And the general sentiment of almost everybody in the study was, yeah, yeah. This place is familiar. It's known. It's either linear with or completely, overlapping with places that I've been in meditation. And one of the most experienced of the meditators that completed this study, I think that individual claimed, tens of thousands of lifetime hours of meditation, which is just a striking amount of meditation. And that I broke it down at one point. I think they had the equivalent of meditating once an hour every day for like 40 or 50 years. And of course, I don't think that they had been meditating for 40 or 50 years, but when you go to week long or month long or multi-month long retreats, those hours can add up. But the point was that, they said, they relived all of their peak experiences from meditation, and that's a powerful statement. But most of the individuals in that study, when we told them during prep that they would be listening to music, a lot of them said, well, okay, but can I just not? What about silence? Please, can I just
Wow.
listen in silence? And at the time, we were stuck to our guns, and we said, well, this is the way we've always done it. This is the model. This is what we think is useful and helpful. So we're gonna play music, but maybe, and we began to play with periods of silence. And for most of the individuals in that study, periods of silence were seen as far preferred to the music listening conditions. So yeah, so this Gaston Eagle, the work that was done in the 70s or reported in the 70s, maybe their no music condition was contaminated by other things, or maybe you have to have a lifelong meditation practice to really sit peacefully and with equanimity in a high dose psilocybin experience, and more likely it's somewhere in the middle, right? But suffice it to say that that's a long-winded way of kind of digressing around the the acknowledgement that we don't know how well controlled these studies were, and there are lots of other aspects that could have contributed to the no music condition not being optimal. Um, and but this is a piece of information that, and this is a signal that we can follow up on. Is the no music condition really not preferable to the music condition? Does that depend on the participant or the patient and their particular situation, or can we kind of prep people adequately to sit with, composure during a no music condition? Um, all open questions, right? Um, Another study. So one of the studies that's been most impactful recently with trying to understand the impact of music on therapeutic sessions was Mendel Kalin's Hidden Therapist paper, which is just a brilliant kind of uh, uh, a brilliant kind of use of the current model, whereas he didn't go in to try to necessarily manipulate the playlists. From what I understand, everybody heard the same playlist, so there's no systematic manipulation of music within the study. But he went back through after the fact with careful qualitative interviews and just got people's experiences and tried to, as best as he could, kind of characterize and at some points quantify people's experiences with the music that they all heard. and again came up with things that I think are not going to be surprising to people. That but he really put kind of put this in clear terms. Music that people resonated with was understood and experienced to be more supportive. Music that was not resonant with a person, music that people even were like unfamiliar with and felt was working against their current mood or their needs was not helpful. Okay, so yeah, on one hand, duh, but on the other hand, no. Obviously, we need to be able to kind of like say these things out loud and back them up with data, and it was incredibly important that he did that. Um, uh, so moving forward, if we can identify music that people can resonate with, we may have an element that we can manipulate in the future studies to really confirm that this is an important part, and then figure out how we can best use that information to optimize people's experiences, right? um, One of the most recent studies of music and psychedelics was essentially an open label pilot study published by Justin Strickland, Al Garcia, Ramu, and Matt Johnson here at Hopkins. In Matt Johnson's initial open label pilot study, where he was studying the effects of psilocybin therapy to treat patients who were smokers and wanted to quit, they had an interesting manipulation where they had a standardized Western art music playlist, which is essentially the standard Hopkins playlist, and a playlist primarily constructed with overtone music. Um, and overtone music is broadly kind of defined as music played with overtone instruments such as didgeridoo, certain types of Indonesian gamelan or other gongs, and this is a special type of kind of sound that is used by some therapists. And the one Alexandre Tanu in New York is someone who's pioneered some of the use of these overtone sounds and overtone music in therapeutic contexts. Um, just for sound therapy more broadly. This was used in sessions, so people were randomized in this study, in Matt's study, to receive either the standard Hopkins playlist first or the overtone music, and during their second session, they received the music they hadn't received in the first session, and then in the third of three sessions the patients received in this study, they got the option to choose which one would you like to hear. And it's a very small open label pilot study, so the caveats abound. But what was important to acknowledge there is that the overtone music, um, I think, was selected slightly more often than the playlist and the Hopkins playlist, and there was at the very least no difference in outcomes of individuals who chose one or the other, suggesting that, like, hey, listening to this overtone music didn't break things, right? We didn't do harm. At the very least, if this effect would generalize to a much larger sample in a controlled trial, then you could kind of interpret this as a non-inferiority effect, right? So people absolutely have incredibly powerful, life-changing experiences with the music in our standard playlist, but they seem to also have those experiences with overtone music, right? Which doesn't follow the rigors and the structure of modern Western art music and compositional techniques and music theory from the past 500 years, and voice leading and counterpoint and all these things. Like, no, that stuff's not necessarily part of the mix here. Um, Fascinating stuff. Studies, a couple studies that I published have come out in terms of suggesting that music that underground therapists select for pre-period or pre-peak or post-peak periods don't necessarily follow any rhyme or reason. They don't. There's nothing that defines that music. But a survey that I published, again, of a small sample of underground therapists, did suggest that there was some kind of continuity between musical selections that are typically chosen to support peak period uh, experiences, and those are elements of composition that include motifs that are introduced and then continue throughout the piece of music, either music that kind of maintains the same energy or kind of compositional structure throughout. There are no surprises, right? Or music that kind of builds over a slow, crescendo throughout the piece. Like Elgar's Nimrod is a classic that does that. And if you're not familiar with the piece, go YouTube it, and it's just an incredibly powerful piece. If you can ever experience it in a live performance, it is just overwhelmingly powerful, at least to me. And lots of other folks have experienced the same. Uh, I was able to reanalyze some data that Katrin Preller had collected. She had this fascinating study where she had people listen to music that was personally relevant, or matched music that was similar but not personally relevant, or just completely randomly selected music, and found that LSD increased meaning making that was experienced during unfamiliar music or not personally relevant music, which suggests that there may be some interaction of psychedelic state and listening to even unfamiliar music, that you're better able to derive meaning from that music. And the reanalysis of the brain imaging data that she collected during that study that I conducted suggested that LSD essentially supercharged, if you will, the activity and the processing in brain regions that are involved in meaning making and autobiographical memories. Uh, Supercharged the processing of music in those brain regions during the effects of LSD. So these are all things that are kind of triangulating around kind of like social, behavioral, and brain imaging measures that suggest there's something special about the relationship between psychedelics and music, and that they may interact in a special way, and that they may reinforce and kind of expand the effect of each other. Um, so those were the big ones that we pulled out of this analysis, and essentially many of the studies that we excluded from, or many of the papers that we excluded from our scoping review out of the thousands that were identified, were essentially either papers that were kind of theoretical or hypothetical, or like, or an opinion piece or perspective, like someone kind of expounding upon how much they know about set and setting and how important it is, and of course it's important, and Tim Leary said it was important, and this other person said it was important, so obviously it's important, and I totally agree. Bringing no data to the table, again, thinking through the theory, thinking through the explanations of why these things may be important, and acknowledging personal experiences, anecdotes, and the use of aspects of setting in various ritual and ceremonial and indigenous settings. Those are all important things to do, but that's not necessarily bringing empirical hypothesis testing to the table, and that's what we were trying to focus in on here. There are also a lot of reviews that have been done, and many of those reviews end up being important for reiterating what we think we know, but challenging insofar as they, some of them end up being a bit of an echo chamber, right? Like, they said this in the past, and of course I agree with them, so I'm going to say it again, but that doesn't mean that that review, or the review that they're reviewing, or the previous opinion was bringing empirical hypothesis testing to the table, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to cover, because you said when looking through the paper, I remember seeing that music was the like kind of the number one studied aspect of setting, and some of the other ones that you mentioned, there was the religious or ritual setting, there was the physical environment, there was group social setting, there was naturalistic settings, but there was one thing mentioned on here that in the article you even alluded to that may be more set than setting, and that was the expectations of the person going into it. And so I would love to discuss, because you said like we could touch on, are set and setting completely separate things. And so it was interesting to me that expectation was listed as a setting, but acknowledged that it may be more of a mindset. So can you talk a little bit about whether you think that those things are completely separate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you think hard enough about many of the aspects of setting that we can define, you could begin to come up with ways that they interact with set, right? So if I know I'm going to be listening to music going in to the experience, forget that. Not even if I know I'm going to be. If I'm having a psychedelic experience, I'm listening to music. That music is much more than simply an auditory uh, stimulus that's being forced on me, right? It's I When I am listening to that music and experiencing it, I am bringing with my experience everything I know about that music. Let me give you a couple examples. So think of a piece of music that evokes an autobiographical memory, and these pieces of music absolutely exist and can be encountered during psychedelic experiences, right? You know, I hear this piece of music, maybe one that I haven't heard in ages, and it reminds me of a lost love, right? And it started as an element of setting, and it quickly morphs into an element of set. So if I know that I'm going to hear that piece of music going into the session, then my expectation for what's going to happen in that session is really changed, right? If I know that I'm going to hear Icaros going into an ayahuasca ceremony, my understanding, my whole kind of cultural digestion of those Icaros uh, is going to be a factor of the experience, right? Um, and set is not something that is set is not something and setting are both mutable. Your experience at one point in a session, I would argue, is going to influence, or at least has the opportunity to influence, the things that happen next, right? And I see set as much more than, someone told me I could see kaleidoscopic images, so I'm going to expect to see kaleidoscopic images. Maybe I have too broad of a view of set, and maybe my kind of understanding and discussion of set needs to be kind of reined in a little bit. But I see culture, I see personal history, I see my own clinical state, all as elements of set. And when you engage with those things within sessions, I believe you're manipulating and getting into the weeds with set. And so I can see lots of different ways that different musical stimuli, for instance, could engage elements of set, which then bring the experience far beyond just like, this is a stimulus I'm playing for someone, so it's obviously setting, right? The very first psilocybin session that I ever guided um, was a pilot session for the meditation study that I mentioned a little while ago. And in this pilot session, our pilot participant was an incredibly experienced meditator of many decades. They walked the walk and they talked the talk. Like, I sat in the room with this individual, and I just felt presence of being in the same room with this individual was remarkable. And um and and uh for the first half hour, 45 minutes, maybe hour of the session, the psilocybin administration session, they were lying on the couch, peaceful. Everything was going fine. And then a movement of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde comes on the over the headphones, and you see their face contort and start to writhe and move, and we said, well, is everything okay? And they said, my God, why in the world would you play this music in this environment with this effect? Oh my God, this guy was a Nazi sympathizer. What the heck is wrong with you people? And like, oh, this is terrible. I can and we said, please, we understand this can be challenging. Just, be present, see what this has to offer. And they were like, oh, okay. I know what I'm supposed to do. This is fine. I'll do it. I'll just be present with this. And we got through that musical selection, and the next one popped up, and the session went just fine, and everything was okay. And the next day we were doing integration, and we asked the individual, so can you tell us a little bit about Wagner? And they said, listen, I know what the instructions were. I was supposed to, try to figure out what I could learn from the experience and sit and be present, and what can you teach me, and all the no, no, nope. I didn't learn anything. It was a noxious experience. I wish it would have never happened, and if I had to repeat it, I would ask to not, please. So there were obviously elements of kind of personal history and culture and far beyond personal history that really impinged upon this individual's experience, that was catalyzed by the music, but turned into something that was far beyond the kind of acoustic waves that were hitting this individual's ear, right? What do you think? Is that a blurring of set and setting? Is that an interaction here of these, or am I thinking about this the wrong way?
I 100% think that it is because when you even first mentioned it, I was thinking back to I was having a very challenging psilocybin uh, ceremony with others, and then suddenly a piece of music comes on and completely everything changed, and it took me a second to realize, but it's the theme song for my podcast, and so the
Oh,
music that
oh,
plays under the
yeah.
intro, right? Which obviously I have a deep connection to. I chose it. It's by Porangi, who he and I were in a band together, and
Mhm.
I love the intro to this podcast. And it completely changed my mindset because my mindset at that point up until had been I feel very alone. Everybody else seems to be enjoying this ceremony. I'm in a room having a struggle. And it was a feeling of kind of worthlessness. And then when it reminded me of my podcast and all the connections I've made with people, like this is a great example, right? It completely changed the mindset just even within the ceremony. So I'm 100% on board with how one can impact the other.
Yeah. So it was a little challenging. We went back and forth a couple times whether we should kind of call this just an analysis of setting, or an analysis of set and setting, or how kind of forward we should be about our thoughts about this. But we figured, let's let people can figure that out on their own. We can discuss this later. Let's just keep it focused. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
complicated, like all
agree.
good things. Okay.
Yeah, it definitely complicated. And I think it's interesting. So you had talked about some of the hypotheses that you could tell were kind of like built in and some of the, biases. And I think that would be an interesting question because I think we all have this picture of the Johns Hopkins study. And so we assume that the soft furniture and the by the way, what's on the Hopkins standard playlist? Um
Yeah.
people keep referring to it. Is it classical? Okay.
I think there's a lot of classical on there. There's a lot of world music there. There's I think there may be a little baroque and romantic. Yeah. So Western art music, broadly speaking, but also some what may fit better into a category of world music. Um, Om Namah Shivaya by what the hell is his name? Can't remember. I'll come up with it. But yeah, it is one of the most powerful pieces across the board for everybody. So it's not just Western art music.
Yeah.
Um, it's primarily Western art music, predominantly Western art music, and then at the end there's some popular music that creeps in on the return at the very end, the tail end of the experience. But yeah, these are uh, Kibbe and Carroll are two philosophers of aesthetics who got into this kind of academic spat a decade or two ago in trying to kind of argue whether high, if you consider like high music, like the most exalted and kind of elevated form of the art, uh, was the only thing capable of really driving true aesthetic experiences, or whether any kind of music, including folk music, could really be considered as generating true aesthetic experiences. And I don't want to rehash that whole debate, but I think there's some thought put into the highest form of auditory art being the best medicine during a psychedelic experience. And I think there's a lot of room to consider that and accept that. But I think that's the principle in which the Hopkins playlist was generated, and I don't think Bill shies away from making that case. And I think that's part of the case that he makes in his in his recent book, was it Sacred uh, Sacred Knowledge, right? And he talks about this in the influence of music and sessions from his perspective, and I think it's a very powerful uh, thing. I think it's a very powerful perspective. I think it's a very powerful medicine. I just would also want to kind of give a vote also for lots of other types of music that can be powerful in this experience.
Yeah, I think I'd heard, especially culturally, if Western classical music isn't culturally what somebody was familiar with or brought up with, and they had a preference for a completely different section of the world music, and that would have that same difference in effect because, like you said, whether the music was familiar versus not familiar, pleasant versus not pleasant, all of that can be a factor. And so I think
Yeah,
that leads into some of the difficulties in the research that you had talked about. Not only does it take a long time to get this research done, period, that like how many different variables are there, even within just say music? Do you know it? Do you not know it? Volume, type of music, all those things. But overall, as we're reviewing all these studies, and there were a number of different outcomes I know that these studies measured. If somebody's at home and P.S. We are not suggesting anybody do psychedelics at home, but just say somebody's at home thinking about setting, or we've got many therapists who listen to this that may be getting into psychedelic therapy in the near future. Uh, Overall, kind of what were some of the themes that seem to lead, if there were themes that seem to lead to more beneficial outcomes?
See, this is the problem. We don't know, and nothing in this review really kind of could satisfy that question. Um, One of the things that we argue for in this review is for some standards to be set and some more systematic research to be conducted across labs and across institutions, because there's almost like a smorgasbord of approaches, drugs that are under study, populations and samples that were involved, and lots of different assumptions of various study teams. So there essentially there's nothing cohesive holding this literature together yet, except that everybody agrees that set and setting are important, and that's great, and that's fine, and I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I'm just, yeah, there is no kind of final conclusion here yet. We're just such early stages, and um, yeah, yeah, that's exactly the problem, and that's exactly where we are right now, which I think is fascinating and really exciting, because the world is our oyster. I think if we as a field can come together to begin to standardize outcome measures, and then begin to agree on how we can try to replicate or not replicate findings across studies, that's a place to start. Um, yeah. You could look at a few of these different studies and say, well, this study said this, so I'm gonna, yeah. I mean, like, some important findings are, I think, definitely findings from Mendel Kalin's Hidden Therapist, really digging into the idea of resonance during therapy sessions. I think you could try to come up with um, factors from the survey of underground therapists that I published, suggesting that there's no rhyme or reason for pre-peak or post-peak music, but there does seem to be a structure that is held together for peak period music. That one of the caveats there is that um, this is an incredibly small sampling of the wide world of folks who are conducting these therapies, and so who's to say that these 10 or 12 people had it right? And why should I follow their opinion? It's completely valid. I think it's important to understand in the context of the Strickland paper that we don't have to necessarily use Western art music here. That should give us all, if we didn't feel like we had it before, it should give us the kind of permission, if you will, to kind of explore this enormous space of music, this infinite space of music, right? And auditory stimuli. There are some folks who will ask me repeatedly every time I talk to them. We're like, yeah, okay, you keep saying music, Fred, but like, there's more to music. There's more to sound than just music. What about you know tuning forks and things that are resonant in the psyche on other levels? And yeah, absolutely. So it's unsatisfying in that it can feel dizzying and overwhelming and disorienting to think about, again, how many levers there are on the organ that we can try to manipulate. But I'll 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 say that I think that music is one of the biggest levers, and I think that there's a world full of questions that can be asked simply within the realm of music.
Yeah. And I think we have a lot of students, master students, PhD students, et cetera, listening. So if you're looking for areas to investigate, I think Fred just opened up a wide can of worms that offers a lot that can be look at all the different levers that you can pull and see if you could, because experiments have to basically just isolate one of those levers at a time to be super useful. Like you said, we know that they like this music, but or they didn't like no music, but what were they told beforehand? So very
Yeah,
interesting areas of
and I
research
think
to
that
pursue.
yeah, I think that if you're clever enough, you can come up with study designs where you're kind of carefully pushing around a couple levers at a time, or honing. Let this half of the participants in the study will push like five levers, and the other half of the participants in the study will push another five levers, and then begin to start, just whittling down the field, right, of possible levers that are important. Okay, so the participants in the first group where we pushed these 5 levers, they had a better experience overall than participants in the second group where we pushed another 5 levers. Maybe the next study will hone in on those 5 levers that we pushed in the first group, right? And so, iterative studies are important here, and there are ways to do it without being a complete and insufferable reductionist. But still lifetimes worth of and careers worth of questions here.
Yes, I love it. An insufferable reductionist. Fred, can you tell people where they can find more about your work?
Yeah, thanks. So, not just my work, but all the work being conducted at Hopkins. There's a lot. We have a number of studies, some proof of concept pilot studies in various novel indications, and others, kind of really trying to fill out and replicate previous findings. So find us at hopkinspsychedelic.org. You can find out all about me and all of my other wonderful colleagues at Hopkins.
Excellent. And just a reminder that if you are wondering about the study that he talked about with Dr. Leo Roseman, there's a podcast episode on that one. We have Matt Johnson on talking about psilocybin for depression and some of the pitfalls of psychedelic medicine, which talk about setting and perhaps overuse of religious icons thereof. And we also have Katrin Preller on. So take a look back at our old episodes. If we've had a number of the fantastic voices that Fred has referenced. So go back and check those out. Fred, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate having this discussion. It was a ton of fun from this end.
Likewise, Lynn, this was great. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave a rating or review as it helps others find the show. And if you'd like to learn more, you can find the show notes at plantmedicine.org/podcast, and there's information for clinicians at psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Our incredible music was by the one and only Porangi. We'll see you next time.